The Vampire Count's roster is pretty complete for the most part, barring from some major characters and a handful of units and heroes. But before I get started with the Literary Lords, I would like to mention that I will only talk about major lore characters or characters with pre-existing factions in Warhammer 2, in order to keep this video relatively short. First, let's address the elephant in the room. The Great Necromancer, the Great Betrayer, the Usurper, the Undying King, the Supreme Lord of Undead, and he who shall not be named, Voldemort! Nagash! Nagash is the creator of necromancy and lord of all vampires, and he came pretty close to conquering the world, until some Nehekaran dude called Alcatazar came out of nowhere and stopped him a millennia ago. This was around the time when the Tomb Kings were human and mortal. His unit roster would mainly be your regular vampire count units, but maybe some landmark building in, say, the Awakening or Henry would allow the recruitment of Vampire Coast and Tomb King units respectively. As for his start location, he would obviously have to start in Nagashizar, one of the mightiest fortresses in the Warhammer world, and Nagash's personal castle and final resting place. He could start off by having Arkan the Black as a military ally or vassal, which could be useful if CA fixes the issues that come with having vassals. He should also have diplomatic bonuses with all undead factions and diplomatic penalties with Tomb King factions, as their mortal, or should I say, immortal enemies. Alright, moving on. Next we have the Red Duke. Now we already had him as a lord since the Realm of the Worlds DLC, but his faction is not playable and he definitely deserves some quest items and a reskin to his faction at least. The Red Duke was a Bretonnian Duke of Aquitaine and one of the most fearsome and renowned warriors in the Warhammer world. He was mortally wounded by some Arabian assassins while on his way home after a successful crusade. Later succumbed to his injuries, but not before getting the blood kiss from Abarash, the first blood dragon. His faction can really just be a reskin of the regular Vampire Count units, to make them look more undead Bretonnian. Maybe throw in some peasant units, a few corrupted knights, and some ethereal knights from Celastra's faction. A really cool mechanic Sia could implement into Musalon is the ability to unlock regiments of renown units by conquering lands in Bretonnia. For example, if you conquer Couronne, you get access to the 12 Black Rel Knights, or if you conquer Parawan, you get access to Undead Pegasus Knights. Something like that to give the player incentive to conquer Bretonnia. Next we have Vishoran, king of the Strigoi. Vishoran was the first Strigoi king and brother of Neferata. He was able to establish a strong and wealthy empire, and this place was pretty cool for an empire led by the undead. There was prosperity and order, and Vishoran and his Strigoi would only feed upon criminals. He was definitely one of the more fair vampire lords in the Warhammer world compared to the likes of Manfred or Luther. So we already have the Strigos Empire as a faction, with Vishoran leading them up until recently though, when they were moved into the Marshes of Madness, where Mokain is located, and with Kadon becoming their faction leader, which makes sense, he was the leader of that land prior to Vishoran taking over. Vishoran's faction could have a human undead mixed roster, as he ruled over both the living and the dead, which would be an interesting roster to see. And maybe some diplomatic bonuses with order factions, as he wasn't really that evil. Vorak Bloodytooth could also make an appearance as a unique recruitable lord, which can be unlocked if you conquer his fortress in the Darklands where Imrik starts. Now we can't talk about Vishoran without mentioning his salty vampire sister, Neferata. Neferata was one of the first vampires. She was both the Queen of Lamia and the Silver Pinnacle. She was exiled from Nehekara after she took the elixir of life, turning her into a vampire. She fled to the Silver Pinnacle, where in which she plots her return. She managed to infiltrate many human nations and establish a large spy network. Alternatively, she could take over the Silver Host faction, currently in Lamia. That would be pretty cool, as Neferata and Khalida are huge rivals, but I think she should start off at the Silver Pinnacle, and maybe a quest line to reclaim Lamia. Her faction could have a mechanic similar to the High Elves and Empire's intrigue system, where you can improve relations with a faction, which in this case would be strictly human factions only, with the use of some new currency, or maybe just dark magic. The final character I'm going to mention is Vishoran, the father of the vampires. He is the first of the Necroc bloodline, and played a part in turning Neferata into a vampire, and aided Nagash in his conquests. Vishoran would obviously start at Kasabar, leading the Necroc Brotherhood. This would be an interesting start place, as you would have the chance of fighting multiple different factions like the Tomb Kings, Sudenberg, Bowman of Orion, Plaqua, or the Dwarves of Carrickzone. Before we move on to the next section, here are some honorable mentions. Conrad von Carstein, Zacharias the Ever-Living, Dieter Helsnitcht, and Aborash. These guys didn't make it in the video because they'll more or less start in Sylvania or in the Empire, and that wouldn't be a very unique campaign unless they were added in as FLC heroes or just FLC lords. There aren't many heroes to really talk about for the vampire counts, and they are sitting at a nice 3 hero choices, but CA could probably throw in a few faction specific heroes, like the Black Knights for Musilon or a Strigor hero for the Strigos Empire. Finally, we have the missing units in the vampire counts roster. Now, like the heroes, the unit roster is also pretty complete. The only new additions I can come up with would be just reskins of already existing models like the Skeletal Giant or the Zombie Halberd or Graveguard Halberds or the Abyssal Terrors, but that might be a little tricky to pull off as each of these monsters is unique in its looks. As you can see, the vampire roster is pretty complete and only missing a few notable legendary lords. Obviously none of these guys will come in Warhammer 2's lifespan, as we have confirmation that the next DLC will be for the Elves, which means the opposing faction will have to be a Warhammer 2 race, but I'm almost certain we will get at least one vampire DLC in the 3rd installment of the trilogy. I'll also have a few links to the mods I used in this video. Thanks for making it to the end, and see y'all later.